Hi, I'm Ann Johans. I'm an Extension Program Specialist with Iowa State University, and today I want to share a little bit of insight on flexible farm leases in Iowa. In Iowa, half of our farmland is under some form of rental agreement, and there are several kinds of farmland leasing agreements for landowners and tenants to consider. One issue that comes up when discussing cash rents is determining what to charge before the crop is even planted. Rent should be in line with farm productivity, crop prices, and costs year to year, but those are highly variable things to predict when we get to those rent negotiations. And so, one option that we might consider is a flexible lease. Flexible leases create some level of risk for both the tenant and landowner. A flexible contract means that instead of setting the rent in advance, as with the cash rent agreement, the parties agree on a formula and then we use that same formula after the crop is harvested year after year. And so we set the parameters and we let it ride. This is when we know more about the size of the crop, what the market is doing that year, and we get to determine the rent after the fact. It's not quite the same as a crop share. Generally, as this chart shows, the level of risk of the various types of agreements. So a flexible lease, the tenant might be taking on more risk, but not all of it. The most recent data we have on the breakdown of leases in Iowa shows that 9% of leases have some form of flex to them. In these agreements, the landowner is not involved in paying any costs, just like with a standard cash lease, right? That they're not involved in making those decisions. And the landowner also doesn't have to do any grain marketing. And so we have advantages of a cash rent lease without some of the disadvantages. There are various ways to go about a flexible lease. One of the more common ones is simply to set the rent as a percent of gross income from either corn or soybeans. And the gross income is primarily price times yield each year. And you need to decide ahead of time, what's our yield source? What's our price source? Are we selecting a specific location for grain prices? And are we going to take an average over time? Most likely, if that's the case. And then for yields, we have a lot of data that might come off the combine monitor, or maybe we're delivering grain from the field directly and we can use some information that way. The other option for a third party source would be using yield data from USDA, National Ag Statistics Service, or Risk Management Agency. They both have yield reports, but they don't come out until the following year. And so you'd be looking at perhaps the end of February, or maybe not even until June, if you're using that Risk Management Agency yield report. And so those are things to consider ahead of time. The other piece to consider is how treatment of government payments and crop insurance proceeds fit into the lease agreement. So if you're including crop insurance payments in the gross revenue, then the landowner is sharing indirectly, right, in the benefits of that risk management tool, but the landowner should also share in the cost. And so what I mean by that is that any crop insurance premium should be deducted from the gross revenue used to calculate the rent, even in years when no indemnity payments are received. And so to consider that across the course of the agreement, not just annually. So from the graph, you can see typical percent of gross cash rents in Iowa and how it has averaged over the last decade. So for soybeans, the average cash rent has been around 40 to 45% of the gross income in recent years. And for corn, the percent has been in the 30 to 35%. So an example of that is that, say, in a typical year, our revenue for corn, 30 to 35% of that has gone towards the cost of the land, basically. So a variation of this type of agreement, this percent of gross income, would be a base rent plus a bonus. And in that situation, a minimum or base rent would be set and therefore reduces the landowner's downside risk. But then the parties agree to share profits in excess of a certain level. And so perhaps this is a percent in excess of the tenant's cost of production to make sure that you're sharing the rewards once all costs are covered, and then to take advantage of exceptionally good yields or exceptionally good prices over the long term. So this graph compares estimated returns to the landowner for three common types of lease agreements in Iowa. The crop share line looks at half of the gross crop value including an average for government payments and crop insurance proceeds for the state, and then takes out average input costs. So half of the average input cost for Iowa includes a factor of drying on corn, does not consider machinery costs. The cash rent line is the Iowa State average from our cash rent survey. And then the flexible lease line looks at an average for corn and soybeans. I'm considering a corn soybean rotation. And so 30% of the gross crop value for corn, and then 40% of the gross crop value for soybeans for every year. In times of steady revenue, cash rent landowners have a solid, steady base and tend to do well. When there are surprises in grain prices, then flexible leases do very well. And you can see that crop share leases do better when that landowner is still participating in yield and price risk on those years where we see some changes in the market. So with these parameters, as I've explained, the 10-year average return, so for the last 10 years, looking at the return to the landowner, comparing the flexible lease to the cash lease, they're only $4 apart. And so it's important to note that yes, year to year, there's variation, but long-term returns between the two agreements are actually usually quite similar. And so it's just making those fluctuations year to year with the market, rather than often we see cash rents kind of being a year behind. So they're making up for maybe what a good year had been, whereas a flex lease is kind of capturing it in the year that it happens. When we develop a flexible farm lease, we want to be sure to put it in writing. Any lease should be in writing, but especially with the flexible lease, we want to make sure we have that formula that's been agreed upon written down so both parties know what the sources are for determining what the rent will actually be. I would suggest working through several examples when using different yields and prices when considering a flexible lease, and include both the high side and the low side to see what might happen and what the range of possible outcomes might be. And also look at applying the formula 3 to 5 years back. And so if we'd use this flexible lease for the last 5 years, what would our rent have been? So that both parties can see how it actually would have played out with real on-farm data. Some of the resources that we have include a publication. We have worksheets to help work through flexible lease parameters, and then we have a decision tool calculator where you can plug in actual numbers to figure out what flexible leases might be, and it includes a table to show you kind of the range depending on various yields and prices. Flexible leases have been used for many years across our state with much success by the parties using them, and it eliminates that need to negotiate rents annually, which no one looks forward to. I encourage you to look at the decision tools and materials that we have on our Ag Decision Maker website for more details on these types of agreements. With that, I appreciate you joining and watching this video today. Contact me directly if you would have further questions, or any of our farm management specialists across the state.